Hey friends, so this month we're looking again at our commitment to the practice and disposition of hospitality. So we often talk about our commitment to hospitality not as a commitment necessarily to host people in our home, but more so as a disposition of presence. So the first line in our rule of life within this commitment to the practice of hospitality is that we're committed to nurturing in each member a hospitality of presence. And this brings up for us a question, like what does it take to become a person of presence? And what would it mean to shape our life towards a disposition to love of others in a way that brings people into a greater awareness of God's love for them? So I want you to take a moment right here, and you can just pause the video. I want you to take a moment right now and just think back to a recent moment when you felt the presence of someone like they were just really present with you in person. So go ahead and just pause and give this a little bit of a minute of reflection. So my hope is that you had some sort of memory kind of come up for you when somebody was present to you, like in that sense of hospitality of presence. And so sitting with this memory, I want you to consider this person's life. Like it's probably someone you know at least a little bit. Like think about the contours of their life. What do you think that they had to be able to set aside to just be there with you? Like beyond just setting aside their phone or carving out space for you in their calendar, what else internally, perhaps, do you think they had to consciously be aware of in order to fully enter in to hosting you and really being hosted by you? Those two things happen at the same time. So what did you have to set aside in order to be present to them? So consciously or unconsciously, there are all kinds of things that work below the surface that we have to put somewhere in order to actually be present to people, to demonstrate to them our hospitality. And look, these people could be our spouse or our roommate or our kids or maybe even people within our community. What this commitment to hospitality is a commitment to be on a journey towards becoming the kind of person who's able to just be with people and to be really present to them in a way that demonstrates their value, in a way that might potentially communicate with our presence the love of God to them. I hope that's coming through. And for some of you, this might end up being expressed in your opening up your home to people, intentionally hosting people. But let's start a little easier, maybe a little bit more bite-sized. What would it take for you in this next month to think of a few people in your life that you could be just fully present to? And I want to set this particular commitment to hospitality in our rule of life. I want to set it right next to our commitment to a contemplative life. And so we might think about hospitality to others and presence to others as the active side of our life. And this, of course, would include any ministry that we do or volunteer work that we might be engaged in. Really, any kind of ministry is a kind of hospitality. We're ministering to someone. And so there's this active hospitality side that comes out in this commitment to hospitality. And then there's the contemplative side of our life and all of the commitments within our rule of life that are meant to support the contemplative posture in life that we've committed to within the order of the common life. Commitments to things like solitude and silence, or our rhythms of prayer, and within that rhythm of prayer, we have a commitment to practicing Lectio Divina, this slow, prayerful reading of the scriptures, and our commitment to rest, which might often include a period of our week where we sort of pull back a bit. So these two features to the kind of life that we're inviting you into, the active and the contemplative, the tension between these two parts of our life, they run deep within the monastic tradition. And so we often might think about the monastic tradition and primarily think about the more cloistered form of this way of life in someone like a Thomas Merton. But remember, the way that we see the tradition developing over time and how we are thinking about our own work is to recognize that the active orders like the Dominicans or the Franciscans or the Jesuits sort of out in the world, they are themselves recontextualizing the tradition that originated behind the monastery walls. And so St. Francis looked at the contemplative tradition of the monastery and he wondered, what would it look like to live like a monk out in the streets among the poor? And St. Ignatius and his friends, inspired by the work of St. Francis, began to imagine what would it look like to live like a monk on mission into the world. And what we see as the tradition gets developed is this tension between the active life and the contemplative life. And it gets fleshed out and it gets practiced and it gets honed in ways that then get institutionalized within each of the orders. And so some of the orders become a little bit more active and others become a little bit more contemplative. But if you think about the whole of the tradition, the whole monastic tradition is basically trying to hold this tension between the active and the contemplative life. This tension, friends, has always been around. And so even back in the 6th century, Gregory the Great, in his book, the Book of Pastoral Rule, which outlined his vision for what it meant to be a pastor, he was trying to describe this tension between action and contemplation. And it's a tension that I'd like for us to think about and to wrestle through together as a community over this next month as we think about our practice of hospitality. So again, Gregory is speaking to leaders, specifically pastors and bishops, so people who had some sort of administrative office within the church. But we can equally apply what he says to our own lives as we think about sort of the office of being a member of a religious order with a mission to serve the church and to be an evangelist in our local church for the love of God. So think with me a little bit about hospitality in that framework as well. He writes this. He says, the leader should not reduce his attention to the internal life because of external occupations. So he's saying you can't pay less attention to your inner life because the people out there in front of you have become a bit too much. Like you're just kind of constantly on the move and constantly receiving people. He says the leader should not reduce his attention to the internal life because of external occupations, nor should he relinquish his care for external matters because of his anxiety for the inner life. So likewise, you can't ignore the people in front of you and the real life matters at hand simply because you want to spend all your time in contemplation. So one more time from the beginning. The leader should not reduce his attention to the internal life because of external occupations, nor should he relinquish his care for external matters because of his anxiety for the inner life. Otherwise, either he will ruin his meditation because he is occupied by external concerns, or he will not give to his neighbors what he owes to them because he has devoted himself to the internal life only. So friends, this tension between how much time you need to spend nurturing your inner world and life with God and love of God, and how much time you should spend being present to others and serving others and allowing all of the work of formation that we've been doing to actually live on mission, this is the tension. And I bet that there are some of you who are watching this and you're thinking about your presence to others and you might be wondering about your own practice of hospitality. And listen, maybe you're realizing that you actually don't have any real presence to give because you're a bit burned out. Like the idea of being able to be fully present to someone in this next month, maybe it just feels a bit out of reach to you simply because you don't know that you can stop the inner churn long enough to be truly present to anyone. And so the question is, what might it look like for you to have a conversation with the Lord about that? Like if in fact that's how you're feeling. And maybe there's others of you who right now are feeling maybe a bit, even some conviction, that there might be something stale in you in your disposition towards others. Like maybe you're a little bit out of practice in your presence to others, and maybe that's because you've been indulging too much in orienting yourself to the contemplative life. And friends, look, I get it. Like, I am more tempted by the latter than I am the former. It's not that I don't get worn out by the presence of people. I really do. But what I'm tempted by is this default setting that I have to increase my time of being alone in solitude. And I feel the tension, and it's something that I talk with the Lord almost every single week about. There are there are no real and hard, fast rules in this, other than that we need to live in the tension between the active and the contemplative. So what I'd love for you to do this month is to talk to God a little bit about your posture towards this commitment to hospitality, and how this tension between being present with people, demonstrating hospitality to people, and staying deep into the contemplative life. How does this tension show up for you? Where do you notice it throughout the month? So friends, if we aren't experiencing some time of contemplation and solitude and deep prayer with the Lord, the practice of hospitality is going to be very difficult. And we can also get stuck within the walls of the monastery that we've created inside of our own soul. But friends, I want to remind you that monasteries have always been places of welcome and hospitality. And even the most cloistered versions of the monastic tradition received guests as though they were Christ himself. And so I want you to think a little bit about the monastery of your heart and whether you are receiving guests in that place. Okay, friends, as always, there's some questions for you to think through and journal through. And I look forward to hearing about how this conversation goes in your formation groups. Much love and grace to you.